Singapore stands its ground. What happened when America tried to pressure the little red dot? Picture a tiny country, smaller than most cities, sitting right next to the biggest superpower on Earth in terms of influence. Now picture that giant leaning in again and again, trying to bend that tiny country to its will. What happens next is one of the most quietly inspiring stories in modern history. Singapore never raised its fist. It never shouted back. Instead, it did something far more powerful. It stood calm, stood firm, and simply refused to bend. This is the real story of how a nation the size of a single American city faced pressure from the United States, not once but across decades, through a shocking punishment dispute in the 1990s and a brutal trade war 3 decades later. Stick with me, because by the end of this you will understand exactly why the whole world respects the way Singapore plays this game. Let us begin. Point 1. The spark that started it all. It was 1993, and an 18-year-old American teenager named Michael Fay was living in Singapore. Over 10 days, he and a group of friends vandalized around 18 cars, spray painting them, throwing eggs, and in one case, smashing a windshield. Under Singapore law, this was not a small matter. It was treated as vandalism, and Singapore's courts sentenced him to 4 months in jail, a hefty fine, and 6 strokes of a cane. In America, this barely would have made headlines. But in Singapore, corporal punishment carried out this way was serious business, applied strictly and equally, regardless of who you were or where you came from. Nobody expected what came next. This local court case in a small Asian nation was about to become a full-blown international diplomatic storm, dragging in the President of the United States himself. What began as a story about vandalized cars turned into a test of whether a small country could hold its line against pressure from the most powerful nation on the planet. Point 2. The White House gets involved. As news of the caning sentence spread across America, outrage exploded. Reporters flooded into Singapore. Newspapers ran furious editorials. And then something extraordinary happened. President Bill Clinton himself stepped directly into the case. He called the punishment extreme and a mistake. He said it in front of the world's press, right there in the Rose Garden at the White House. Think about that for a second. The President of the United States was publicly pressuring a small nation over the punishment of a single teenager. The United States Embassy in Singapore joined in too, arguing that the damage Fay caused was not permanent, so the punishment should not leave him with lasting scars either. This was not quiet backroom diplomacy. This was loud, public, and relentless pressure applied at the very highest level of American government, aimed squarely at forcing Singapore to change its mind. Point 3. The senators pile on too. If one president pressuring you was not enough, imagine an entire chamber of lawmakers joining in. That is exactly what happened next. 24 United States senators signed a formal letter, appealing directly to the Singapore government to grant Michael Fay clemency. This was not just executive pressure anymore. This was the legislative branch of the most powerful country on Earth, putting its name behind a campaign to change a small nation's legal decision. The American media machine matched this political pressure step for step, with newspaper after newspaper calling for businesses to consider pulling investment out of Singapore if the caning went ahead. It is hard to overstate how much combined weight was now bearing down on this one small island nation. A president, 24 senators, and a media storm all pointed in the same direction, all hoping Singapore would simply fold. Point 4. Singapore refuses to back down on principle. Here is where the story becomes genuinely remarkable. Despite the presidential appeals, despite the senators, despite the threats to the relationship, Singapore's leadership did not treat this as a negotiation about geopolitics. They treated it as a matter of law and sovereignty. Officials made clear that the law had to apply equally to everyone inside Singapore's borders, citizens and foreigners alike. The government's reasoning was simple and unshaken. If exceptions were made for foreigners under outside pressure, the entire legal system would lose its credibility and its deterrent power. This was the moment Singapore drew its line. Not with anger, not with insults toward the United States, but with quiet, unmovable resolve. It sent an unmistakable signal to the world that Singapore's laws were not up for negotiation, no matter how powerful the country asking for an exception happened to be. Point 5. A carefully calculated compromise. Singapore did make one adjustment, and it is worth understanding exactly why. Out of respect for the long, friendly relationship between the two countries, and as a gesture toward President Clinton personally, the number of strokes was reduced from 6 to 4. But notice what this compromise actually was. It was not surrender. The caning still went ahead, carried out on the 5th of May 1994. Singapore had found a way to acknowledge the relationship with America without abandoning its principles or its legal system. This is a masterclass in small state diplomacy. Give a little on the margins, so the bigger partner does not lose face entirely, but never give up the actual substance of your sovereignty. Fay was caned, served his reduced sentence, and returned to the United States weeks later. Singapore had bent slightly in tone, while standing completely firm in action. Point 6. The fallout that followed. The consequences of Singapore's firmness rippled outward. The relationship between the two nations grew genuinely strained for years afterward. The United States Trade Representative even reportedly considered trying to block Singapore from hosting the World Trade Organization's very first ministerial meeting, a significant diplomatic and economic prize Singapore had worked hard to secure. Yet despite all this friction, Singapore's economy, reputation, and global standing did not collapse. If anything, the episode became part of Singapore's international identity, a small nation known for extremely low crime, strict but consistently applied laws, and a government willing to accept short-term diplomatic pain rather than compromise its core institutions. Decades later, this single case is still remembered and studied as a defining moment where a small country proved it could say no to the world's most powerful government and survive completely intact. Point 6. The fallout that followed. The consequences of Singapore's firmness rippled outward. The relationship between the two nations grew genuinely strained for years afterward. The United States Trade Representative even reportedly considered trying to block Singapore from hosting the World Trade Organization's very first ministerial meeting, a significant diplomatic and economic prize Singapore had worked hard to secure. Yet despite all this friction, Singapore's economy, reputation, and global standing did not collapse. If anything, the episode became part of Singapore's international identity, a small nation known for extremely low crime, strict but consistently applied laws, and a government willing to accept short-term diplomatic pain rather than compromise its core institutions. Decades later, this single case is still remembered and studied as a defining moment where a small country proved it could say no to the world's most powerful government and survive completely intact. Point 7. Fast forward to a new kind of pressure. More than 30 years later, in 2025, a very different kind of American pressure arrived, this time through trade rather than diplomacy. The United States announced sweeping new tariffs on imports from countries around the world, including a baseline tariff of 10% applied to nearly everyone, Singapore included. This came as a surprise because Singapore actually has a long-standing free trade agreement with America and runs a relatively balanced trading relationship, unlike many other countries targeted. Despite this, no exemption was granted. Then things escalated further. By September of that year, the United States announced a staggering 100% tariff on branded and patented pharmaceutical products, a sector that matters enormously to Singapore's economy. Once again, a small trading nation found itself squeezed by decisions made thousands of miles away in Washington, with little say in the matter. Point 8. No retaliation, just a task force. Faced with this pressure, Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong did something notably calm and strategic. Rather than firing back with retaliatory tariffs of its own, which many other nations chose to do, Singapore formed a national task force specifically to help businesses and workers navigate the disruption. The approach was measured rather than combative, focused on tackling immediate uncertainty, protecting the sectors most exposed to the new tariffs, and building resilience for the years ahead. This mirrors the same underlying instinct Singapore showed decades earlier during the Canning dispute. Do not escalate emotionally. Do not trade insults. Instead, absorb the pressure with a clear head, protect what actually matters at home, and let calm, methodical action speak louder than any angry press statement ever could. Point 9. Backing words with real support. Singapore did not stop at forming a task force. The government rolled out concrete financial support to cushion the blow. This included corporate income tax rebates to help struggling businesses stay afloat, along with new schemes specifically designed to boost productivity and help companies pivot into fresh markets less exposed to American tariffs. On the household side, Singapore introduced cost of living support, including Community Development Council vouchers, special vouchers tied to the nation's 60th anniversary celebrations, and rebates to help ordinary citizens manage rising costs. There was also increased assistance for the most vulnerable groups in society. This mattered enormously because it showed the world that standing firm against outside pressure does not mean leaving your own people to suffer the consequences alone. Singapore made sure its citizens and businesses felt protected while the government handled the larger diplomatic and economic pressure from above. Point 10. Strength through regional unity. Finally, Singapore did not try to face this challenge completely alone. Just days after the tariffs were announced, Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister joined a special meeting of ASEAN economic ministers, convened specifically to craft a unified regional response to the new American tariff measures. Southeast Asian nations, often competitors with each other on trade, came together instead to present a coordinated front. Analysts observed that the wider Asia-Pacific region, and Singapore in particular, prioritized negotiation over retaliation, leaning on the country's flexibility, neutrality, and strength in digital trade to weather the storm. This is Singapore's long game in a single sentence. Do not fight alone when you can build alliances. Do not escalate when patient. Unified negotiation can achieve more. Whether the pressure came from a single president in 1994 or sweeping tariffs in 2025, the underlying playbook stayed remarkably consistent. Finally, Singapore did not try to face this challenge completely alone. Just days after the tariffs were announced, Singapore's Deputy Prime Minister joined a special meeting of ASEAN economic ministers, convened specifically to craft a unified regional response to the new American tariff measures. Southeast Asian nations, often competitors with each other on trade, came together instead to present a coordinated front. Analysts observed that the wider Asia-Pacific region, and Singapore in particular, prioritized negotiation over retaliation, leaning on the country's flexibility, neutrality, and strength in digital trade to weather the storm. This is Singapore's long game in a single sentence. Do not fight alone when you can build alliances. Do not escalate when patient. Unified negotiation can achieve more. Whether the pressure came from a single president in 1994 or sweeping tariffs in 2025, the underlying playbook stayed remarkably consistent.